Right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining in. We're going to start with a picture to show a nice calm picture of Teignmouth, nice peaceful picture, which is a completely different picture to the time that I'm going to be talking about this afternoon. So, right, Teignmouth in World War II. Like many families of those born in the 1950s or earlier, very little was ever spoken about what life was like during the war in any detail, probably as it was still too raw in all their memories. When I was born, rationing was still in place for some things, and of course it was never covered at school as it was too recent. Past generations were not as open as we are today with discussing everything. You just picked up snippets here and there when something came up on the TV or in the local paper. Therefore, much of the following information I have needed to read up about, although some I did know. Throughout the country, street lamps were switched off and effective coverings fitted to every window. Tape was glued across window panes to restrict flying glass. Morrison shelters replaced kitchen tables, and Anderson shelters were entrenched in many gardens. Food and fuel went on ration. Gas masks were issued to each person, including babies, and the masks were to be carried at all times along with identity cards. Children's gas masks were usually made of bright colours so as not to frighten them, and the baby's mask would have totally enclosed the baby with air supplied by a hand pump. Teignmouth, like everywhere else, was busy preparing for the likelihood of war. An honorary air raid precaution organiser was appointed in 1938, and ARP literature was sent out with rate demands. This encouraged 319 volunteers at the first appeal. Training was given into how to cope with anticipated poison gas attacks. Arrangements were made for dealing with death by war, transportation of bodies, mortuary and burial arrangements. At the outbreak of war on the 3rd of September 1939, the population of Teignmouth was about 10,000. There were just over 9,800 entries on the 1939 register, which was taken on the 29th of September. And this was similar to a census with an enumerator visiting each household to immediately issue national identity cards. This same register was used the following year to issue ration books when rationing started on the 8th of January 1940. This figure of 10,000 did not include those men that had already been conscripted, but it would have included the first wave of evacuees sent from London and the southeast to the safer environments of the country. There's more about this later. In June 1940, the War Office issued over 14 million leaflets. If the invader comes, what to do and how to do it. There were 4 official shelters holding about 50 people in each, as well as the basement of the Riviera Cinema in Teignmouth. That could hold 60. This cinema is the tallest building on the seafront opposite the pier. Most schools had their own shelters, which were also used as communal ones. Another 50 could be housed in the lavatories behind the Royal Hotel. Not a very nice thought, but which overlooked the Den, and the large green area on the seafront. The hotel is now the Royal Court Retirement Flats. That's in that vicinity. I'm not quite sure where. There were also underground toilets on the seafront, where the roof can still be seen between the ice cream hut and the skate park, and in the Triangle as well, the open space in the centre of town. These were filled in several years ago. There was an underground tunnel that led from a building called the Grotto, which was near the Catholic Church in Dawlish Road, and this led to Eastcliff House, which was later called the Overcliff Hotel. This was on the opposite side of the road and was demolished much later for the Eastcliff car park, and this too was used as a shelter. A report centre was set up in the lower floor of Bitton House, then the council offices, and this was manned day and night, and they liaised with the air raid wardens. The air raid siren was on top of here, and I can remember it used to muster the local firemen. The actual siren is on display in our museum. The Air Ministry requisitioned Holden Aerodrome at the outset of war. In 1941, it was commissioned by the Admiralty as HMS Heron II, a satellite of RNAS Yeovilton operations. And after several mishaps, the runways were lengthened, and that in 1942 to include most of the adjacent golf course. Operations were frequently affected by poor weather, and in May 1943, the unit moved. As soon as war broke out, Teignmouth docks could no longer trade with foreign countries in Europe, which affected its export of clay from the Kingstainton quarries. And when the German Navy had gained control of the Channel ports, the coastal trade from London and the Tyne in coal was stopped. A Royal Navy river patrol was formed of retired local sailors and fishermen, and they closed the river mouth each evening by placing a boom of 2.5-inch thick wire from the point over to the Shaldon side. These posts were still visible up to recently, and I believe they still are. They also installed anti-invasion tripods in the estuary. Morgan Giles Shipyard expanded rapidly and at times employed over 150, including 20 women. The shipyard was fully occupied and required working 7 days a week. Over 100 Admiralty craft, including many complex specialised craft essential to the coastal defences, were built and maintained here throughout the war. About 9 vessels continued fishing throughout the war, and access to the harbour was only allowed for these craft. They could only get back in the harbour by use of a predetermined recognition signal using 2 letters of the Morse code, and these were changed daily. Fishermen were fined if their boats were not immobilised. Various groups were formed, including a rescue party, 3 first aid parties, a road repair squad, a decontamination party, along with a fire watching section. One of the viewing points for the fire section was on top of the Riviera Cinema, which was an excellent vantage point with views up the river and also along the coastline. The Coast Guard lookout shelter on Eastcliff Walk opposite the Lido, which is now used for the National Coast Watch Institution, that was manned day and night throughout the war years. There was a lookout at Spray Point, that's where the Teignmouth letters are along the seawall towards Holcombe, and this could not be reached from the seawall as it was blocked by anti-invasion barricades. The railway line was used for access, and on 2 separate occasions, auxiliary coastguards were killed by trains, sadly. There was a halfway cafe at Spray Point, and orders from the War Office were received to remove all the equipment. When the owners arrived, they found that everything had been thrown into the sea by one of the regiments stationed here, and the cafe never reopened. We'll just go and show a picture of that. And that's what that looked like. Can you all see the slides? Yep. Okay. By 1940, barbed wire and a 15-foot high scaffolding had been erected on the main front beach, extending around to the river beach and also the beaches in Shaldon. This was a fascination for children who played on the scaffolding, but this was cordoned off and the seafront was strictly out of bounds after the first raid. Many sets of iron railings were removed and were usually cut off at the base. The stubs can still be seen where they were never replaced. This was to provide scrap metal for munitions. Maybe this was done for War Weapons Week. You can still see this on the wall on the left as you leave Teignmouth and go down Bitton Park Road towards Tesco. and also on the wall by the converted church at the end of Bridge Road in Shaldon. There was an anti-tank trap on the seafront by the pier, which was a sunken garden with a wishing well when I was growing up. This was filled in when the new seawall and promenade was altered in the early 1970s. Maybe there were more anti-tank traps, but this is the only one I found a report of. Not long after the meeting, a regiment from the Royal Air Force moved in, and they manned armoured cars either end of the Shaldon Bridge, which were mounted with twin Bren guns. The RAF were then replaced by the Royal Artillery light anti-aircraft batteries, and there were 2 anti-aircraft guns on the bridge. Both 4 guns were strategically placed around both Teignmouth and Shaldon, and 2 Royal Navy rocket projectors were put in place, one on the seafront near St Michael's Church and the other by the docks. The batteries for these electrically fired rockets were charged up at Morgan Giles shipyard. Apparently the noise from these could be heard for miles. At some point, the Royal Marines were billeted at the Courtney Hotel, where Nissen huts were erected in the car park. And that's another view of those, which I'm sure you'll recognise that. As the army went further afield, an appeal went out in March 1940 for men to form forces to be known as the Local Defence Volunteers. These were renamed to the Home Guards 3 months later, and several were formed here. Training took place 2 evenings a week and on Sundays. In a field near Labrador above Shaldon, an assault course was set up where they practiced the use of hand grenades. They mounted nightly patrols, and when the air raid siren sounded, extra patrols were sent out. The Home Guards patrolled the railway line from Shaldon Bridge to the first tunnel at Holcombe end of the seawall, and both ends of the 5 tunnels between Teignmouth and Dawlish were manned when invasion fears were at their highest in 1940. Army regiments stationed nearby also mounted patrols, and at the height of invasion, they manned dugouts and firing points positioned all along the front. These were constantly manned along with the Home Guards sentry post at the Shaldon end of the bridge at the entrance to the embankment opposite the church. A stand down of the Home Guard was ordered in November 1944. The railway line and Morgan Giles shipyard were the main targets. The railway line because of its significance as a main route for Plymouth-bound freight. The signal box was hit with machine gun fire, but there were no injuries. Many houses close to the line suffered direct hits, but it was remarkable that the railway line escaped with very little damage. Various fundraising weeks were held to support the war effort. War Weapon Week was held in March 1941, followed by Warships Week in the first week of November of that year. These were national campaigns to raise money from the public to fund the shortage of weapons and the rebuilding of warships that had been damaged or sunk. Each city or town was set a target depending on its size, and Teignmouth hoped to raise £160,000 for a corvette warship to be adopted by the town. Wings for Victory Week also received excellent support, raising £119,000 in 1943. The town pulled together for fundraising, organising various entertainments, door-to-door collections were held, and everyone was encouraged to save, buying national savings stamps which were stuck on a card. And once 15 shillings had been reached, these were exchanged for national savings certificates at the post office. Children were encouraged to enter competitions, with the prize being a savings certificate. According to Wikipedia, the total raised throughout the country was over 955 million, the equivalent today of about 50 billion. In 1942, after sustained bombing, a public meeting was held, and this was when, I think I've gone a little bit out of order of that. So I apologise there. Many local girls joined the Wrens, and they were based at the Marina Hotel at the southern end of Powderham Terrace, which is opposite the Point car park, along with other Wrens from further afield. The Royal Navy used this hotel as their mess room, and apparently the Wrens had their fair share of fun, attending dances with the ratings at the London Hotel in Bank Street, which is now flats and the pound shop. From 1943 to 1945, HMS Mount Stuart shore establishment was set up. This secret unit, specialising in regular warfare, consisted of servicemen and women from the Navy, Royal Marines and the Army under the command of Captain Brunton, who led 35 officers, 60 ratings and 25 Wrens, and they were based at the Royal Hotel. They worked in buildings on the Eastern Quay and garages on Lifeboat Lane, developing and testing various equipment, including mobile flotation units, part submarine and part surface craft with diesel engines. These had a crew of 3 and used submersible canoes, which ran on batteries to set limpet mines on German ships. They also developed explosive motorboats, which were dropped from Lancaster bombers with a diver inside and 3 parachutes attached. The helm was locked on towards its target, and the diver returned to safety as best he could. HMS Mount Stuart took part in the Victory Parade on VE Day, after which it was closed. In late 1943, the town was inundated with American servicemen. Some residents thought at first that the Germans had arrived overnight, as the river was full of landing craft and the promenade with equipment. So everyone thought something was about to happen. They were billeted in many of the hotels along the seafront with our troops, and also at some hotels in Dawlish Road. A sick bay was also set up in one of the hotels, the Sundial Hotel. The Den Pavilion, where the Carlton Theatre was, and latterly where the Pavilions now stands, was used as their mess room, and the local girls were invited to the regular dances held there, maybe persuaded by gifts of cigarettes, chocolates and nylons, hence the saying that was synonymous with the GIs, overpaid, oversexed and over here. After a few months, the GIs and the equipment began to move out, and they were deployed to the South Hams for training at Slapton in readiness for D-Day in June 1944. When they departed, all the billet windows along the seafront opened, and according to one eyewitness, numerous balloons were released, which were inflated to condoms. I'm going to include some information about Shaldon, as this too played a vital part in defending the area. Several sites survive in Shaldon, and just look, if you're parking the main car park up at the Ness and walk down, you will see in front of the Ness House Hotel, by the seats overlooking the estuary, there is a permanent display board and the map showing Shaldon's World War II coastal defences, and some interesting facts put together by Tim Mole, a local resident. I'm walking down towards the village on the left on the steep bank. Above there is a concrete patch where a machine gun stood. As you go round the corner by the mouth of the river, there is a lookout shelter on the left, where there was a sea searchlight, and on the riverside there is a platform area which was surrounded by a wall, and this housed another machine gun. Further along there is a 2-storey building on the left, which housed another sea searchlight. This has now been converted into a holiday cottage. As mentioned earlier, a boom was put across the mouth of the river each evening, and the remains of the post used to secure this is embedded on the foreshore nearby. By the ferry shelter, a row of concrete and steel posts were constructed, which could be raised and lowered. And when these were raised, large steel angled posts were fixed to them to form anti-tank traps known as hairpins. There were also 7-foot high concrete walls erected to block off several entrances to the village from the river beach. Although this was covered with barbed wire, there were gaps to allow access to the ferry. A large brick building was built on the green in the centre of the village, and this was the public air raid shelter, and the school was set up as an emergency centre. On the 15th of February 1941, over 1,000 incendiary bombs were dropped by an aircraft which had been hit and which eventually crashed near Totnes. The bombs dropped near New Barn Farm, which is high up behind the Ringmore area of Shaldon. On the 13th of August 1942, a bomb fell on the green in the centre of the village, bounced and went over the houses and landed in the allotments just below the main Torquay Road. In the Penalterate raid on the 18th of May 1943, a high explosive bomb blew up the end of what was Teen House Hotel, now Dolphin Court Apartments, just along from the church. Another high explosive bomb landed on the beach in front of the church, and on low tide, you can still see the shape of the crater it made. I grew up in Shaldon and returned there in 1990 until 2009, but my parents and mother lived there from the 1930s. During the war, my grandfather was an ARP warden and first aider, having already served in the Royal Medical Army Corps during World War I, which included on the Western Front and at the Battle of the Somme. All men aged 18 to 40 had to register for service unless either medically unfit or exempt due to working in key industries such as baking, farming, medicine or engineering. Women took over the shortfall of labour working on the land, the Women's Land Army, or in factories, and at the end of November 1941, the government made an amendment to the National Service Act, which made provision for women to be called up. At first, it was only childless widows and single women aged 20 to 30, and as my mother fell into the latter category, she too had to register and was enlisted into the Wrens. Rather than be immobile, which would have meant being based at a hotel in Teignmouth, she enlisted as mobile on the 28th of November 1941 and was first based at HMS Drake at Plymouth for training as a telephonist, and after just a week moved to the Royal Naval Hospital in Plymouth, and then on to Maristow House, which was near Beeralston, just north of Plymouth, which was being used as a hospital for servicemen. Here she met my father, who was already in the Royal Navy at the outbreak of war, and who served on the Arctic convoys from 1942 to 1944. Going back to the evacuees in Teignmouth, in 1938, with the real possibility of war imminent, the Ministry of Health sent out a survey to all local authorities to ascertain how much surplus accommodation was available in each area, allowing one person to one room in each house. It also asked how many householders were willing to accept evacuees, particularly teachers and unaccompanied children. The total number of surplus rooms in Teignmouth was calculated as 8,597, meaning many evacuees could be housed. Operation Pied Piper, as it was known, began on the 1st of September 1939. Teignmouth Grammar School had to make space for over 200 staff and pupils of Haberdasher Girls' School, that's a bit of a tongue twister, from London, resulting in 4 different lessons being taught simultaneously in the school hall, and attics, changing rooms and cloakrooms were used as classrooms. The Habs pupils used the craft block, sports field and gym in the mornings, whilst formal lessons took place for local children, and this was reversed for the afternoon. Of the primary schools, Brook Hill had 261 children, and Our Lady and St Patrick Catholic School had one teacher and 15 children. The latter was the old school at the bottom of Dawlish Road, and other schools used the various church halls. As no bombing had occurred during the first few months, it became known as the Phony War, and nearly half of all evacuees returned home by January 1940, with many more returning to London after the Blitz in the summer of 1941. The Habs Girls' School stayed in Teignmouth until they moved to North Devon in 1942 due to the bombing, but in 1944, over 250 from Habs Boys' School arrived in the town. In June 1944, when the Doodlebugs, that was the German V1 and V2 flying bombs, when they were bombing the London suburbs, the council were informed that 250 mothers and children were coming to Teignmouth and billets needed to be found. It was also reported in the Teignmouth Post that 421 children from Acton in West London were evacuated here. 198 went to Dawlish and 223 came to Teignmouth. Any unaccompanied children were taken in by householders voluntarily. A report to Teignmouth Council in September 1944 said the official number of evacuees were 1,294, of whom 501 were unaccompanied children, 229 mothers with 374 children, 130 other adults and teachers, and 60 children in requisitioned homes. Right, about the bombing. Proportionate to the size of the town, Teignmouth suffered many bombing raids aimed mainly at the docks and the main railway line, and although these were not damaged, much of the surrounding areas suffered considerably, with loss of life, and many buildings were either destroyed or damaged beyond repair and were consequently demolished. The first raid was in July 1940, almost a year after the outbreak of the war, and the raids continued for almost 4 years, until the last raid in May 1944, a year before the end of the war. In total, Teignmouth, Shaldon and Bishop Stainton endured 22 air attacks, 460 alerts, over 1,000 incendiaries, and 79 high explosive bombs were dropped. Many of those were what was known as tip and run raids, a bombing raid carried out at very low level and at high speed by German single-engine fighters. Of the 22 air attacks, although only half of these involved loss of life, the others caused widespread damage. The harsh reality of war was realised when the first raid took place on the 7th of July 1940, when 2 bombs were dropped near the pier, landing either side of it, and injuring 13 people, 4 seriously, which included 8 children. One of the seriously injured, a 16-year-old girl, died of shrapnel injuries in Teignmouth Hospital the following day. There was no serious damage to property other than shattered windows, but this was very worrying for what was to come. Let's have 2 minutes to reflect on the devastation caused over the next few years. We just watch a short DVD. Thank you, Paul. I've just picked out some raids of particular note. The hospital was bombed on the 8th of May 1941, killing 3 nurses and 7 patients, and a further 4 patients suffered minor injuries. The hospital was then housed in temporary accommodation at the Hermosa House Hotel in Hermosa Road, now Hermosa Gardens, until the one we know today was built on the same site as the bombed one and opened in 1954. On the 13th of August 1942, 8 bombs were dropped throughout the central area, killing 14 people, including a fireman, and injuring 23. The town hall, marketplace and fire station stood on the site where the Brunswick Street car park has been for many years, although this is where the proposed Premier Inn is due to be built. On the 2nd of September 1942, bombs fell either side of Brook Hill Primary School, which is where Liddell's is now. It caused damage to the school, but only a few pupils had minor injuries. Had it been a few minutes later, they would have been on their way home and caught up in it, as many properties nearby were destroyed. 8 people were killed and 33 injured. In the same raid, the hotels on the seafront were bombed, but luckily they were empty of the troops who were billeted there. The worst raid for loss of life was the one on the 10th of January 1943, when 20 people were killed and 27 injured, with severe damage to numerous properties throughout the town, as 7 planes came over at low level and fanned out, each dropping a bomb. The next 2 raids were the final ones and did not involve any loss of life, but much damage was caused. This is a map showing the bomb sites transposed onto a 1938 bomb. You can see, hopefully, there's the hospital up Mill Lane, 2nd Avenue, and that's all the central area. The 2 hotels on the seafront here, and obviously the town hall and the fire station in the middle of town. These are some of my own photographs from a helicopter trip, and probably the enemy planes flew in lower than this picture, using the river as a marker from either direction. I have pinpointed where the bomb sites were now compared to now. You've got Bomb Park Terrace here at the back of Teignmouth, and Yannon Drive, which is more or less opposite the school playing fields. And you've got 2nd Avenue out towards Tesco Way. Powderham Terrace out on the seafront, opposite the Point car park, and obviously the hospital in the corner there. And then you've got Gloucester Road flats, that's where the new Exeter Road comes down. Salisbury Terrace, opposite the fire station, and Highbrook Street by the roundabout. Haywards Close of the Belgrave Terrace, that's at the back of the station. And Brook Hill School. Myrtle Hill, that's where the small car park is by the roundabout opposite the museum, and that was the cottages there were demolished, and then obviously out on the seafront where the shop, that's where the hotels were, where the Shoppers car park is now by the Fish and Chip Cafe, been in McCool's. In this area, the central area was extensively bombed, with obviously going for the railway line coming down through the middle there. And then you've got the town hall and the fire station in the centre of town, and the pier where the very first one landed. On May the 7th, 1945, Germany signed an unconditional surrender at Allied headquarters in Reims in northern France, to take effect the following day, which was declared a public holiday. Many people did not wait until the official day of celebration and began the festivities as soon as they heard the news on May the 7th. Millions descended in central London, and here local residents organised many street parties throughout the town. Teignmouth's outburst of thanksgiving was best illustrated by the attendance of 8,000 to 9,000 people who gathered on the Den for a united service at 3 p.m, led by 6 local clergymen. A victory parade took place, which assembled in Station Yard and included most of the town's organisations. They marched through the town to the Den, headed by Team Battalion Cadet Band, and here they were joined by the Brownies and the pupils from the junior school, along with their headmaster. Loud applause greeted the British and American Navy and the Royal Marines as they marched past the 13 flags of the Allies on the bandstand. That's where the public toilets are now on the seafront near the War Memorial. And the Salvation Army Band accompanied singing led by church choirs. It closed with the national anthem, and a record played the Star Spangled Banner. In the evening, a victory ball was held at the Royal Hotel, and the tickets cost 10 and sixpence, including refreshments and a licensed buffet until 11 p.m. The final death toll was 79 people, and there were 151 casualties. Of the 2,957 houses in the town, 228 were completely demolished, and 2,250 were damaged. Only 479 houses were unscathed. Ironically, of those who went to fight for their country from Teignmouth, 146 were killed in action, less than double those that were killed at home. All of these names were added to the War Memorial on the seafront, and a further 9 from Sheldon were added to the Sheldon Memorial clock by the Green. But I'll talk a little bit about post-war Teignmouth. When the war was over, there was a major housing problem, with so many people in Teignmouth needing to be rehoused. As outlined in the Housing Temporary Accommodation Act of 1944 by Prime Minister Winston Churchill, prefabs, which were prefabricated houses constructed in a factory, would be supplied to help alleviate the problems throughout the country. Over 100 of these were constructed on fields near up towards the hospital, and we'll just see another. And this is where the prefabs were all built. These 100 were constructed on fields near the hospital by foreign prisoners of war held in the local prison camps. And although they were envisaged to last only 10 years, the prefabs were not demolished until the 1970s to be replaced with the council houses and blocks of flats at Kingsway. When my father was demobilised in 1946, my parents and older sister were allocated one of these prefabs, and I was actually born there in the early 1950s, and have fond memories of growing up on this estate until we moved to Sheldon in 1965. The prefab was fully equipped with a large kitchen, which was big enough for 5 of us to sit around a table for meals. It had plenty of cupboard space and a walk-in larder. It also had a gas cooker and a refrigerator and a copper to do the laundry. Outside, it was surrounded on 3 sides by gardens, and my father grew all our vegetables in the enormous back garden. It was a very friendly community, and everybody knew everybody else and kept an eye out for the children playing in the streets. Due to the lack of traffic, we could play safely, even playing tennis in the road outside our prefab, which was one of a row of 3 in the lane leading in from the hospital into Lower Kingsdown Road. The housing estate was lit by gas lamps, and I can still remember the gas man coming round each evening and lighting them. This brings to a conclusion of Teignmouth during World War II, but I wish to thank the following. The old photographs have been used by kind permission of both the museum at Teen Heritage Centre and Viv Wilson MBE, and the research has been done with the help of the Teignmouth and Sheldon Remembers World War II website, along with 2 books written by Viv Wilson, Teignmouth at War 1939 to 1945 and Teignmouth at War II, which are on sale at the museum. Teignmouth at War 2 is more the memories of local people, but certainly the first volume is well worth a read. This concludes my talk. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you, June. That was fascinating. Very well put together.
Thank you.
If anybody would like to unmute themselves and have a chat or ask any questions, then please do.
Thank you, June. That was brilliant.
That was very good.
Thank you.
Anybody got any questions for June?
I wanted to ask you, what's a copper? You said that in the prefab, you'd had a copper to do the laundry. What was a copper?
It was like a big square washing machine, if you like, an early day, and it had a big circular thing in the middle on there, and then you put your clothes all in that. And
you use the handle?
No, because I can remember we had a wringer outside that we used to have to put, you know, it just literally sort of washed it and activated it, and I suppose prodded it all around. And then you had a wringer. We had an old-fashioned mangle out in the yard that we used to put the washing through.
So did each prefab have one each then?
Yeah.
Wow.
No. They were all individual. It was a gas refrigerator as well, which sounds really rare, which, you know, something you don't hear of. But and it had a small icebox container. I can remember that. And, you know, when you're talking, this is 1940s, you know, it was
very posh.
Yes, it was. Yeah, that's right. And it would solve some of, you know, a similar thing, obviously a different standard on there. It would solve a lot of our housing problems today, wouldn't it? To have things like that put up.
Paul was saying they look quite cute. I agree.
Yeah, the thought of a prefab is, to me, traditionally, a prefab is somewhere that you would be desperate, you'd have to be desperate to live in. That as a prefab, that looked quite good.
Yeah, no, it was fine on there. It's a bit noisy when the seagulls, especially if they got a bone on them and they were walking along across the tin roof on there.
Yeah.
I expect the early ones, I expect they had asbestos in them as well. You don't know, do you, on there, how they were put together, but
How many bedrooms did they have?
We had 2 bedrooms, and it had quite a big hall. There was my mum and dad, there was 3 of us, and the big hall opened out and went back into like a big alcove, and my brother had a single bed in the hallway there, so that, and then there was me and my sister and mum and dad in the other room. Fairly big, you know, big rooms on there. A big lounge. I know. Well, we had a piano, we had a big double table and a 3-piece suite in our lounge, and it had 2 big windows. Yeah. That actual picture is from a prefab, and that was the same. There were several types of different prefabs, and that prefab is at St Fagin's in just outside Cardiff. There's a living museum there. I'm due to, hopefully me and a friend are going to go up when we can get out of this lockdown and pay a visit, because I think it would be quite interesting to see.
Absolutely.
When was the hospital built, June? When was the hospital built? The main one?
The new one?
Yeah.
The new one was opened in 1954. And that was the first NHS hospital, because I think the NHS came in 1948, didn't it? And this was the first hospital that was built in the new, you know, under the NHS, which is why I think there's such a lot of
it was built on top of the old one, was it?
There was the old one, the very old one, going back years and years ago, is actually on the site where I live in town, which was on the top of Myrtle Hill.
Near the school.
Yeah, that's right. That one was the old hospital. And then it was built, I think, in the 1930s, late 1928s, early 30s. And then that one was bombed. And that's when it went up to a temporary hotel. And then until the new one opened. So it was in a temporary building for 13, 14 years before the new one opened in 1954. whether it will be saved remains to be seen.
Yeah.
It's most probably already rubber stamped a bit, but we're a little bit the
Very
poor relation because, you know, Dawlish Hospital isn't very accessible, is it? Unless you drive. It's right at the back of Dawlish, but we shall see.
Yeah.
Anybody else got any questions? Shall we wrap this one up then?
Yeah, lovely. Thank you very much. Hope you
Thank
found,
you,
very
June.
much.
hope you found it
Great.
interesting.
Very good.
Very
Very good.
interesting.
Yeah, very
Thank you.
interesting. Thanks, June. Really good.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Bye,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye.
Very
Bye.
informative.
Bye,
Yeah.
Paul.
Bye-bye.
June.
Bye.
Thanks a lot. Yeah. I'll come back to you, Linda, because I found out some bits for you.